the document with all of you through
Great.
chat.
And now we're live.
We'd like to welcome everyone to our special Women's History Month webinar. This conversation subject is in honor of Women's History Month and celebration of every person who identifies as a woman and the women around the world who have organized, worked, and called for rights, dignity, and opportunity. This is the 7th webinar in our series. I'd also like to take a moment of silence for the 8 Asian American women who were murdered as a result of a violent hate crime by a white terrorist in Atlanta. Women's history is inclusive of every person who identifies as a woman. The pioneers of women's liberation also expands beyond the white figures, so often put on a pedestal. This panel will highlight the intersectionality of women's history around the globe, with historians specializing in fields ranging from Latin America, Africa, China, Europe, and the United States. The struggle for women's liberation is an ongoing one, and what we take away from the preparation for today's talk and engaging with the world around us is this, as Emma Lazarus has said, until we are all free, we are none of us free. I'd like to thank the Committee on Inclusion and Diversity, specifically Frank Gurity, and the Department of History for their support in this series, and our department chair, Adam Costo, is always also very supportive. I'd like to also thank Manan Ahmed. He actually motivated us and encouraged us to turn our webinar series into a podcast, which is something that's always been a dream of Emma and mine, and Manan really encouraged us and helped us take these webinars to the next level. So please be on the lookout on Apple Podcasts, and I believe we're also on other podcasts where you can find In Conversation with Historians. I'd like to thank all of our amazing panelists for joining us, and my name is Saida Islam, and I'm the Faculty Affairs Coordinator, and now I'll turn it over to Emma.
Thank you, Saida, and thank you all to those who were mentioned and all the panelists here for coming today, and everyone in the audience who's here to come share this conversation with us. We will be taking live Q&A throughout, so if you're on YouTube or Facebook, please comment your relevant questions to the panelists, and if you're on the Zoom, there is a Q&A function. My name is Emma Scheinbaum. I'm the co-organizer and co-moderator with Saida. I'm the Communications and Development Coordinator here at the Columbia History Department. And I will now introduce our panelists for today. So Dr. Kelly Carter-Jackson is the NAFL Assistant Professor of the Humanities in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. Her book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, won the James H. Brousard Best First Book Prize, was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, a finalist for the Museum of African American History's Stone Book Prize, and listed among 13 books to read on African American history by the Washington Post. Carter-Jackson is also co-editor of Reconsidering Roots, Race, Politics, and Memory, the first scholarly collection of essays devoted entirely to understanding the impact of Alex Haley's roots. Her essays have been featured in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, NPR, Time, Black Perspectives, and Quartz. She has also been interviewed for her expertise for MSNBC, Sky News UK, New York Times, The Guardian, PBS, Vox with a V, the HuffPost, C-SPAN, and the BBC, Public Boston Radio, Al Jazeera International, and Slate. Carter-Jackson has been featured in a host of documentaries and podcasts on history and race in the United States. She sits on the scholarly board for the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History and is also a commissioner for the Massachusetts Historical Commission. She co-hosts the podcast, This Day is Esoteric Political History. Lastly, she is a proud mom of 3 children. You can follow her on Twitter at @KCarterJackson. She is actually also a PhD history alum of Columbia. Dr. Maria Eugenia Cotera is an associate professor in the Mexican American and Latino Studies Department at the University of Texas, Austin. She holds a PhD from Stanford University's program in modern thought and an MA in English from the University of Texas. Her first book, Native Speakers, Ella Deloria, Zora Neale Hurston, Jovita Gonzalez and the Poetics of Culture, received the Gloria Anzaldúa Book Prize for 2009 from the National Women's Studies Association. Her edited volume, Chicana Movidas, New Narratives of Feminism and Activism in the Movement Era, also published by University of Texas Press, has been adopted in courses across the country. Professor Cotera is the co-founder and project director of the Chicana por Mi Raza Digital Memory Collective, an online interactive archive of oral histories and material culture documenting Chicana feminist praxis over the long civil rights period. She has curated several public history exhibits, including Las Rebeldes, Stories of Strong and Struggle in Southeast Michigan, and Chicana Fotos, Nancy de los Santos, and currently serves as an advisor consultant to numerous large-scale digital public humanities projects focusing on the Latinx experience. Professor Cotera has served on the National Council for the American Studies Association from 2007 to 2010, the governing board of the Latino Studies Association from 14 to 15, and the program committee for the National Women's Studies Association from 2017 to 2018, and the Arte Público Recovery Project governing board till this day. We also have with us today Eugenia Lean, who is the director of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and professor of history at Columbia University. Her research focuses on the history of modern China. Her publications include Public Passions, The Trial of Xi Jinzhao, I'm sorry if I butchered that, and The Rise of Popular Sympathy in Republican China, which was awarded the 2007 John J. Fairbank Prize. In her recent publication, Vernacular Industrialism in China, Local Innovation and Translated Technologies in the Making of a Cosmetics Empire, 1900 to 1940, explores how lettered men of early 20th century China pursued industry and science in unconventional ways, experimenting innovatively with both local and global practices of manufacturing. Dr. Lean has also received a number of academic fellowships and a National Endowment of the Humanities grant, and was recently a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies. She was featured in Top Young Historians by the History News Network, and received the 2013 to 14 Faculty Mentoring Award for faculty in Columbia's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. She is currently writing a book on China's involvement in shaping 20th century global regimes of intellectual property rights, from trademark infringement to patenting science. We also have with us today Elisheva Carlebach, Salo Whitmire Barron Professor of Jewish History, Culture, and Society. She specializes in the cultural, intellectual, and religious history of Jews in early modern Europe. And lastly, but not least, Hilary Hallett teaches broadly about the cultural politics of the United States from the antebellum period through 1968. Her research focuses on women's history, comparative feminisms, and the relationship between popular culture and changes in gender and sexuality in a transatlantic perspective. She is currently completing The Siren Within, Eleanor Glynn and the Invention of Glamour, which explores the transatlantic networks that supported the success of the British sex novelist and early Hollywood personality, Eleanor Glynn. Great, so now that we have all know who each other is, I'll open up the conversation. So this goes to everyone, so whoever wants to jump in first can. How did each of you come into your studies, and what motivated or drew you into the field, as well as your specific areas of interest? How has that relationship grown? Someone jump in. Elisheva, maybe you can start. Or Kelly, I saw you unmute first.
Okay, I will. Hello, everyone. I started my historian journey at Howard University, my alma mater. I was a junior at Howard University. I was a journalism major, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I knew I wanted to write. I knew I wanted to tell stories. And I got into a program called the Ronald Mcnair Scholars Program, which helps underrepresented students like get into graduate programs. It's a pipeline program. And I had a mentor, Edna Medford, who took me to the archives for the first time. And I'll never forget going to Moreland Spingard Research Center on Howard University's campus. And, we put on gloves, we went into the small room, and, they handed us a folder. I opened the folder, I took out a letter, I read it, and it was signed, affectionately, your father, Frederick Douglass. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, is this real? And she was like, yeah, that's what historians do. We look at the original documents. And I was floored by that. I was like, okay, I'm all in. I'm all in. And so my passion for history really began at Howard University, looking at the Black abolitionists, looking at Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Mariah Stewart and Lewis Hayden. And it's really just grown from there. I got to really do a deep dive in graduate school with the things that I was passionate about. But Howard University is where it all started for me.
I'll just say very briefly that I got hijacked into history from a track that was completely other. I had intended to become a psychologist. I have always been deeply interested in the human mind and human potential. And I had such wonderful history teachers in the City University of New York that drew me away from studying the people in front of me to studying what came before. And eventually I came into Jewish history and the early modern period, which is a time for me of constant motion and movement and re-examination of classical and medieval heritage that begins to break up just at around that time. So that's how I came to specialize in the period that I specialize in. And I came into a field that was predominantly about ideas and not so much about archives, but about texts. You have the Bible, and then you have the Talmud, and then you have this text, and then you have that text. And the fact that there is actually an absolutely immense archival, rich documentary legacy that hadn't been nearly as well explored. And as I move forward, the voices and experiences of women come to the fore in ways that I had never imagined or anticipated, and it's still an ongoing project.
Maria, I don't know if you want to speak to that, because we had a conversation earlier about the label historian.
Oh gosh. Yes. So you might have noticed in my bio that I in my doctoral program was modern thought and literature. So it's an interdisciplinary program. I worked with many historians, obviously, but how I came to be engaged with the archive is as a master's student in English, actually. And I was the research assistant, luckily enough, of Dr. Jose Limon, who was writing a book at that time about a Tejana, a Texas folklorist, Mexican-American woman who had worked very closely with the father of Texas folklore, J. Frank Dobie. And in the process of working for him in the archive, I discovered evidence in their correspondence that she had written a novel about the borderlands in 1848, and nobody knew, and the novel had never been published. And so we began to look for it in Dobie's archive, and we didn't find it, but luckily at that time, her caretaker, she had passed away. Her caretaker was getting older, and so she asked some archivists to come look at Jovita's studio. And in the studio, we found not just a novel, but also a book of folklore, previously unpublished. And I became fascinated with this idea of lost or hidden archives, actually. And so we published the novel. It's called Caballero. She wrote it, interestingly enough, on the borderlands in 1938 with a white woman whose husband owned a gun shop. And in fact, the first half of that novel, the typescript, is on the reverse of gun shop correspondence, which is very rich for someone who's trained in literary studies. I was just like, my mind was blown. What does it mean? And so that really got me on a path of a different kind of archival relation, very similar to what Saidiya Hartman talks about as critical fabulation. In the absence of archives, what do we do in the absence of we've come to expect women of color, especially, to be absent from the historical narratives, right? But what happens when women of color and their experiences are absent from the archive, and what kind of work can you do? And that's sort of the work that has preoccupied me both theoretically and in a practical sense since really my graduate school years. So the questions around the archive and absences in the archive and how that shapes our understanding, our collective understanding of the past.
Maybe I'll jump in because I had a very similar relationship with the archives given my interest. But I was also at Stanford as an undergraduate, actually, just to go back a little bit. I knew MTL quite well, but I was actually a history undergrad, but I was also an activist. And back then it was Take Back the Night were the big issues, as well as, sort of disinvestment from South Africa and so on and so forth. But from a gender perspective and a women's activist perspective, Take Back the Night really drew me into questions about, feminist politics, but also feminist politics. I was also coming to grips with being Asian American prior to getting to Stanford in the late 80s. I'd always thought of myself as overseas Chinese, and the late 80s, early 90s was a period. Did I freeze? Oh, okay. Sorry. Did everyone? I have internet problem. Did you guys? Okay. I think I'm back, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But anyways, identity politics were kind of emerging as an issue on college campuses in the late 80s and early 90s. And that drove me, Asian American studies was very inchoate at that time. And so I turned more towards issues of my own heritage as a Chinese American to my historical past, like the history of China. And, but I wanted to merge both kind of my activist politics with my interest in knowledge and how knowledge is produced in academia. And so that brought me to the issue of politics, which is something that informs all the work that I do. But one thing I did want to just bring up is that when I was a graduate student at UCLA, it was kind of the height of cultural history. It was also the height of women's history was shifting to gender. And I want to talk a little bit about that today, what it means during Women's History Month to talk about the difference between women as a subject position versus the issue of gender, which is front and center in a lot of discussions, gender and sexuality, in a lot of contemporary discussion today. And it also shapes how we do work on women's studies versus kind of a gender studies approach, which might be something worth thinking about. My first book did, and that was something that very much preoccupied me as a graduate student. And my first book, it featured a woman who was this very heroic.
We lost her. She'll come back. Hilary, if you wanted to pick up.
Sure. Yeah, that was frustrating not being able to understand Eugenia. So I guess just very briefly, my route to history was probably even more circuitous than some of the other routes that have been described, because I started off actually at the Tisch School of the Arts studying theater and film, and then worked actually as a producer briefly for an independent filmmaker out of New York, and increasingly was sort of working behind the camera and not really sure if that's what I wanted to do. I got more interested in really wanting to write my own histories of things. And part of this was also working in the film industry, in the 90s. It was a pretty rough, sexist, culture. And as someone who was a feminist, a lot of that was very difficult for me to take. I'd sort of been raised by a, liberal, old school kind of feminist who, had raised me also Italian immigrant. My mother's parents were Italian immigrants. And so a lot of the arts in our family and a love of old movies. And so one of the things that had always really struck me was that a lot of the older movies that I grew up watching on TV or with my grandmother and mother, with the great actresses of the 30s and 40s, those were not the movies that New Hollywood was making. And on the one hand, I had been sort of in film school taught to really revere a certain canon of filmmakers that idolized the New Hollywood. But, as someone who briefly, touched that industry, it was not a place that I felt comfortable working. And so when I went to graduate school, I went to the City University of New York, and I ended up working with a social and cultural historian named David Nassau. And very early on, I knew that I wanted to work in the period of the first, the early 20th century, when the beginnings of mass culture started. And I knew I wanted to do something about gender and women, but it really wasn't more specific than that. And David was working on a biography about William Randolph Hearst, who played a big role in early Hollywood. And, I was one of his research assistants helping him on this book. And so he actually said, I was reading stuff, by Frances Marion and all of these powerful women writers that were still a residual of women's even more powerful role in very early Hollywood in the silent era. And, we kind of came to it together, I guess, that not much had been written yet, right? That really looked at that early silent period. And then as I got interested in it, film history really became a growing field. And so there was this whole group of scholars, mostly not in history departments. So a lot of the people that I work with, are not in history departments, but do historical work. And that's my first two projects really came out of that, early archival work through Hearst and the early film industry.
Thank you, Hilary. Eugenia, if you had anything you wanted to close with, I know you got cut off, and then we can go on to the next question.
Why don't we go on? Just all I want to say is that I do hope we talk a little bit about the craft of writing history about women, because it was brought up in a couple other comments as well, that actually studying women and gender issues sometimes brings you to unconventional archives. That is something that I very much experienced.
Might be a good opportunity to talk about that
Sorry?
now. Yeah, let's talk about that now. How have been your experiences navigating the archives? How has it been different studying women throughout history?
Okay, so I guess I'll just start, but I think this is also something to do. One thing that was exciting about.
I think there was
we're losing you again.
Can I start? Yeah.
If someone, Eugenia, we're losing Eugenia, so someone else.
Okay, so maybe why doesn't somebody else?
Oh no.
Right. I think for the sake of time, we can have one person speak on that, and then we'll move on to the next question. But if anyone wants to add anything.
On the archive?
Yeah.
Oh my.
As briefly as possible.
Yes. Let me just say that so my work currently right now is really centered in the archive. And the question of, we can think about archival gaps and try to close them in certain ways, but my work is really, really focused on collecting archives and oral histories to address those gaps. And so in a lot of my writing, I talk about the feedback loop of historiography, which is essentially like, if you're not in an institutional archive, then you're less likely to be written about. Your experiences are less likely to be recorded in scholarly monographs. And if you're not in scholarly monographs, your archive is less likely to be, collected in an institutional, by an institution. And so that creates a feedback loop for a lot of historical experiences, which I'm sure everybody on this panel understands and has experienced themselves. That's all I'm going to say about it, because we're being very brief, but I will just also say that, in response to this, for the last 10 years, we've been collecting archives from basements and attics and under beds, and talking to women in recording this more proximal history. And so, I can talk about that later, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Am I clear now?
No, it's still.
Can I just jump in very quickly about sort of?
You might want a hotspot. I
Sorry.
think maybe that'll work better, because it's still patchy with the internet.
Turn off your camera, maybe, Eugenia. Did you just say that too? I'm sorry. That might.
Can you hear me now? I don't want to take up too much time if I constantly continue to be patchy.
We can hear you.
Okay, yeah. I want to talk about that. Okay, great. And sort of how women's history and gender history. You can't hear me?
No.
Can you hear me?
A little bit.
I would suggest maybe try hotspotting it. Sometimes I have to turn or restarting your Wi-Fi, maybe joining us after. Does anyone else want to comment before we move on to the next question? Nobody? Okay. My next question is for everyone. Can you speak on your experiences as an educator in academia, but also the importance of activism? It's almost as if one cannot exist without the other. Women are still fighting for equal rights. Can you speak on some of the issues we face as women today? So your experiences as an educator in academia and the importance of activism, and then how, you know, what type of issues are women facing today, or perhaps what type of issues are you all facing today as women in academia?
Sure, I can speak to that. I'm going to be moving around a little bit just because the sun is coming in my office and it's a big glare. But I on the first day of all of my classes, I encourage my students to be student activists. And, you know, it's really important to me that they don't just get this knowledge, but that they take this knowledge and then act on it. So how are the things that they're learning going to impact their vote, going to impact where they shop, going to impact where they work, how they work, who they hire, who they fire, who they recruit and retain, where they put their children in school, all of these really big life decisions that are made immediately following graduation will have an impact on them for the rest of their lives. And it's not disconnected from the things that we're studying in the classroom. And so I really want them to know that they have a lot of my students who are white, who are affluent, they have an incredible amounts of power and privilege, and that they have an opportunity to be able to use that to uplift others. And the ethic I was always taught at Howard University was, you know, lift and climb, like this is not just for yourself. And so, you know, I'm constantly letting students know that this work is not complete until you do it. So it's not going to be about what you read, it's going to be about what you did. And that has huge implications for them from the moment that they graduate and the choices that they make from here on out.
Thank you for that. Elisheva, since you're not on mute, can you go next?
Sure. Just again, briefly, one of the things that I want to impress upon all of us is how, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Carter Jackson, for that. I think that's really important to hear. The way you said it was eloquent and beautiful. How much has been accomplished since the days that I was a both graduate student and beginning professor. These little steps that our forebears have taken have borne a lot of fruit. There's a lot left to be accomplished, but women have accomplished amazing strides since the days. My mother-in-law was a professor, and the minute she became pregnant and began showing, that day her employment ended. It was just assumed that you could not work and be in that condition at the same time. People don't realize how many strides we've taken. So I want to pay homage, so to speak, to the generations that came before us in a certain way. I remember being in a classroom, both as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, and having professors weeping in class. During the 1970s, when I was an undergraduate, there was a New York City fiscal crisis, and almost all recently hired, untenured professors who were mostly women and people of color were fired from the city university system. Many of them never came back into academia. Some people, I heard later, had taken their lives. It was absolutely traumatic. And there were no protections. There was no discussion of how to protect the more vulnerable. So when I hear some of the things that we're accomplishing today, I feel it's important to emphasize that what we do and what we all encourage our students to do have very real world, life-affirming consequences. Let me step back and let someone else reflect.
Thank you. Was there anyone else who wanted to add? because we can also move to the next question. Oh, Hilary.
I mean, yeah, I also really appreciated what both Elisheva and Professor Carter Jackson said. I mean, I think for me it works in two ways, and one is somewhat related to what's been said about the teaching. You know, again, working at now Columbia with very privileged students. You know, I think this is, you know, the year where everyone has become conversant with the idea of structural racism or structural sexism. But I feel like that's what I've tried to teach in social and cultural history all the years I've been teaching, right? Is to show the deep tissues and structures of that in our culture and society. And, you know, some of that comes, as all of our scholarship comes from speaking, I think, potentially in part to some of the people I grew up around, right? And sort of teaching what I wish they had learned, right? So that they couldn't sound so ignorant. And I feel like, so that's one piece of it. And then the other piece of it is that, you know, increasingly in my own work, you know, one of the roles I feel, you know, interested in playing is helping to get people that tell stories about stuff I know about to tell them better. Right. And so working, you know, with filmmakers and documentary makers and TV producers to try to get them to tell history better, which doesn't mean that they're going to exactly tell the story I want them to tell. That's not the role, but the role is to at least make them understand, you know, what the stakes were at the time, and, you know, to have the context, have some real content to it. You know, so I guess that's how it works for me in two ways, both in the classroom, but then also, you know, in a more public facing role.
Thank you.
I might, oh, can I, okay, hopefully I won't cut out. I'm really sorry about the connectivity issues. But if I understand the question is sort of, what are we trying to teach the next generation? Is that right? What are we trying to impart on our students through our teaching?
Yeah, it's just your experience as an educator in academia and the importance of academia and activism, and just speaking on some of the issues that we face as women today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wanted to link it back to women's studies and gender studies, because one of the things that I think that these two fields have contributed to academia in general is the importance of understanding power. And also, but you know, especially gender studies and sexuality studies. This came out of, you know, Foucault being very influential in the 1990s, and the issue of knowledge having power. Because that's what we are in institutions that are at the apex of many, you know, I mean, these are very prestigious universities, and we're teaching some of the leading, you know, future leaders of the nation, if not the world, including the international students, right? And I think one of the things that I really take from gender studies and sexuality studies and try to bring to recognize that the knowledge that we're producing in our classrooms are infused with power. So we have to have responsibility when we kind of, you know, wield that knowledge. And so I think my connection is unstable. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just keep cutting out. Can you hear me now?
We did hear a good
so maybe, okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. We were able to get like 99% of what you said, yeah. So you're good. And in this vein, the next question, can some of you share some of your research specifically on women in history or in activism and revolutions or your respective fields, and how you connect those findings to the present day? Maybe Maria, since we haven't heard from you in a bit.
Well, I think this connects to the whole conversation that was just happening, which was so interesting to me. You know, I've been collecting archives with undergraduates for 10 years now. And basically our process is we go into women's homes, we develop relationships of trust with them, or we already have them, and we hear their stories. and collect and scan and digitize their archives and then collect them in a very large digital repository. And in that process, one of the things that I've seen happen a lot is that the students, these hidden histories, right? So these are not histories that are commonly included in documentaries or narrative accounts of the movement years. In fact, they're actively excluded. And these women were also excluded from Chicano studies to a large extent, and therefore their voices did not get recorded, and they did not record their own experiences. As you know, many of the people who wrote about the movement years were basically professors who had participated in the radical activities of that time. So they ended up telling their own story. But the thing that I think is important about the archive, and maybe this returns us to that, is that when students encounter a radical archive developed by people their own age, some 50 years before, they encounter not just a past that is incredibly inspirational, but also a potential future. And this is what I think is so interesting about the archive and my experience with it, particularly the archive of the 1970s and the varied women's movements of the 1970s. The radical imaginaries that are exhibited in the archive become sort of sources of potential new radical imaginaries. And they graft onto students ideas about what they wanted, the change they want to see in the world. So yes, their context is different, but there is something about the presence of the past in the archive, especially the radical archive, that is really transformational. And I often tell the story, when I realized this was the first trip that we ever took, and students were in my mother's archive, in fact, and scanning and talking to her as they did it. And the last day we were on our trip, I forced them to go out. We were here in Austin. I wanted them to enjoy the nightlife, and they'd been working like till 2 a.m. every night. And they came back with tattoos from the archive. So they left and came back with these permanently emblazoned symbols of imagery that they encountered in the Chicano archive. By the way, only one was a Chicana, right? So this imagery spoke in some really deep way to unrealized radical, imaginings that these young women had, and it completely transformed their lives in much the way Kelly was talking about. And I think that, for me, that is the pedagogy, right? It is in the work that we do in this sort of space of transgenerational memory exchange, which includes me, a middle generation, women of my mother's generation, and women of your generation, and that scenario is so incredibly powerful. And that's kind of where my pedagogy and research lie, right? I'm less interested in monographs and articles, though I have to write them, I'm required to, than I am in that active process, that active transgenerational exchange. I don't think that answered your question, but I'm gonna let some of my colleagues.
Well, Maria, you really inspired me to share just a short story of how, I came to know you. It was through studying Chicana history, Chicana feminist history, and it being so difficult to really find primary sources. And I was calling, up these former Chicana activists, and one of them was your mom, Marta Cotera, and it was so hard to get a hold of her. And I'm like Googling for hours trying to find her. And then I found you, and I was like so inspired. I'm like, her daughter is a Chicana historian, and it was such a beautiful and inspiring story for myself to hear that. So, but I'll let others speak now.
The question was just about connecting your research to the present day, if you wanted to speak on that, or we can just move on to.
I'll add a quick note. So I study the abolitionists. And I study not just the abolitionists, but I also study violence and political violence, the politics of violence. Violence as a political language. And the more I study social and political movements, the more I'm just empowered and encouraged, because I see Black women everywhere. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my research is to really tease out the voices and the contributions of Black women more. I think oftentimes when we're talking about violence, at least in my own work, will say something like, oh, there was a mob or there was a gathering. And the mob is almost always deemed all male, like women don't riot or women don't get caught up in the fray. It's just all men. And that's just simply not true. Women are always there. Women are at every gathering. Women are oftentimes spearheading a lot of the work that's being done. And so when I look at the abolitionist movement, Frederick Douglass has this great quote where he's like, there is no movement without Black women. There is no movement. And I think about the suffrage movement, and I think about Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. There's no suffrage movement without Black women. There's no long freedom struggle or civil rights movement or Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter movement without Black women. And so the thing that really empowers me most is that when I trace this thread all throughout history, I see Black women at the forefront. But what I also see is how so much of Black women's contributions have either been forgotten, marginalized, or silenced. And so when we think about, I'm always joking about how when we think about Black history, we only get like one great man and one great woman per century. Like, you know, in the 19th century, it's Harriet Tubman, and then it's Frederick Douglass, and then it's like Rosa Parks and MLK. And it's just like one great Black man, one great Black woman. And if you think about that, the men, your Douglases and your MLKs, are always vocal. They're always giving speeches. Everyone's quoting them. No one quotes Tubman. No one quotes Rosa Parks, right? No one is quoting women in these movements. And so a lot of my work, my activism, has been about giving voice to the voiceless, giving them volume, cranking up the volume, and really showing the value that they have in all of these political and social changes that we see over time.
Does anyone else want to answer?
I'll say one small piece of an archive from way back when. I was looking at something completely different, the scribal culture of a Jewish community, looking at all different types of records. And then you come across a cemetery record in which is a little notation next to certain names. And it took me a while to figure out what the notation meant. It was illegitimate babies who were born to single women, Jewish women, because the cemeteries were segregated by religion. And that made me go back to all the other records to find out who these mothers were. They were servant girls serving as adolescents in these households, and Jewish servant girls in Jewish households who were clearly exploited because they were vulnerable, they were away from home. This was something that was Europe-wide, but also here it was in front of me. Nobody had ever told their story. I never even heard of their existence. And I've been specializing in this period and this population for all these years. My next book will revive them.
Oh, that's beautiful. And I think that our next question is drawing off of our current discussion. Where do we see hierarchy and sexism still existing, and what are the ramifications? I'd like to start with Elisheva, and can you talk about in your studies, you've mentioned that you found that there was a shift from conceiving women in the classical way as a second category to humans to a more modern humanized conception. How was the perception of women by those evolved over time? If you can speak on that a little bit.
Well, I'm just going to give a little history lesson, so to speak. If you think about it, from classical antiquity through the Middle Ages, you have a conception of women as a second sex that is by biological nature constituted to be inferior to and in a kind of servile position to men. I would love to hear from some of the other panelists. This is something that's, when we talk about structural, again, sexism, when we talk about structural ideologies that underlie entire societies and that are not questioned for centuries and centuries, and then suddenly you begin to see the ice cracking, so to speak. Structural shifts begin to happen. Little by little steps get taken until sometimes the entire structure collapses, and you move forward in a way that allows humanity to progress, all of humanity to progress in a better way. So that to me is what excited me about the early modern period. It was the beginning of taking apart some of those deeply entrenched ideas. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, even today. We're just, and again, we could talk about lots of different things. So I'm going to step back.
Is there anyone else that would like to answer? Okay.
Maria.
Or Maria, yeah.
I mean, I would answer in a little bit different direction, which I want to thank you for that wonderful and very brief history. And I think it's important to remember that there's structures inbuilt into the academy, for example, that are still very sexist, even though women do constitute, I believe, 51% of college-going students in the contemporary period. But I'm thinking here of how practices and disciplinary ideas really shape the valuation hierarchy of values of the academy. So for example, if you're really engaged in public humanities or digital humanities work, if you're building a collection, those kinds of activities are still sort of in the realm of feminized labor. And so they're less valued than interpretive practices that we as historians and cultural historians engage in. So our books, for example, are more valued in the academy than pretty much anything else that we do. And I was thinking again of this long history of Black women's infrastructures of care in the history of abolition and the civil rights movement. The same, I think, is for Chicanas. They're the ones who are supporting these movements, but they're not the heavies that are, making theory, and the revolutionaries, right? They're not allowed to be. And so I think the same, we can think of the system of valuation, for example, I'll just give the example of Chicana por mi Raza, our project. We have 10,000 digital items in our collection, over 150 oral histories. It's a massive collection, the single largest collection of the archival record of Chicana feminism in the world. And yet, it is not valued the same as if I wrote a monograph based on a much smaller data set. Like I could write a monograph on just one organization, and it would have much more value in it than the 10-year process of building this repository for other scholars and students and the community to use. And so I think we really need to think about, how that system of valuation, that hierarchy of values in the academy is really about feminized labor, and the kind of labor that's, sort of shunted off to archivists who are always imagined as female for some reason. And, and the interpretive labor is really the labor that's valued. And of course that's gendered, as Eugenia was saying earlier, and so thinking about, in the contemporary moment, how our very practices are gendered in that way, and how we value things and our own labors.
I was gonna, if I could just add to that, I would say, we really have to take into account the pandemic and how it has impacted women's labor. There's been a lot of really good articles, in the New York Times and the Washington Post. There's been podcasts that talk all about this, but women have taken on an exponential, increase in terms of their labor and how they are taxed mentally, physically, emotionally. As someone who's a mom, and I had a baby the day before the shutdown, and I still don't know how, I'm surviving, but when I think about just how much moms have carried the burden, the financial burden, the educational burden of their children, of having to teach classes and conduct Zoom for your small children, or check on the well-being and the mental health of your family members, caring for family members. There's so much about being a woman where we are not just caretakers, but we are the people who maintain kinship, and not being able to maintain kinship in a pandemic or at a distance has also had a huge impact just on the way that production and things like publications are produced. And I think that we just have to be very honest about this, because as we start to open up again and people start to go back to normal or whatever that is, like, women are still scrambling to catch up to, they were scrambling before the pandemic, they're scrambling after the pandemic, because the setbacks have been so difficult and so burdensome, to the point where a lot of women are leaving the workforce,
Right.
Not just in academia, but in other fields. You no longer see them stepping up to plates or getting promoted in the same sort of ways that men are able to do. And that's something I think that a lot of schools are trying to figure out. Okay, so how do we rectify this? How do we take this into account when women go up for tenure? How do we take into account the fact that your maternity leave was a real maternity leave and paternity leave was sabbatical? Like those things have to be talked about, because studies show men get more productive with their leaves, with their parental leaves, than mothers do. It's hard for me to crank out an article if I'm breastfeeding. So these are just things that have to be pushed to the forefront and prioritized. And this is when it really is about equity and not about equality. This is when equity matters.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to just join in there too. I mean, I think, as in so many areas, exactly what Kelly is saying, right? We see happening, what problems that existed pre-pandemic have gotten worse. And, specifically within the academy, but for women in pretty much every field, what studies have shown now for a generation, right, is that it's when women have children that they really start to fall behind, right? And many, there was the whole opt-out thing that everybody was so, fascinated with for a while. If you have a lot of money, maybe you just decide not to do anything at all, because it's the intensity to a parenting, right? And what we expect parents, mothers still mostly to do, right, is so high. I mean, from my own perspective, I think that is what I tell graduate students to be aware of, right? Is that it's really, that's the flashpoint. And I personally think in some ways graduate school is an easier time having had children. I don't know how you feel about this. As an assistant professor, when I look back on it, I wasn't as busy as a graduate student as I was as an assistant professor, right? And so I wonder sometimes about the messages that we're giving our students about those issues, because I still see them as being huge impediments to, women's success in the job.
The fact that the tenure clock always coincides with women's childbearing years. There are just that many years you have to accomplish a family, and they often coincide with the same years that women strive for tenure. And it always kind of amused or shocked or saddened me that no sooner did women win the right to either stop the tenure clock when they had a child, or maternity leave, as you call it, it became parental leave. And then there was no advantage, so to speak, anymore. Women are still struggling on the same treadmill.
Yep.
And if I can add just real quickly, I will say that when women do come off of maternity leave, there's an expectation, and I've seen it, to play catch up. Like, hey, you were gone a year, so why don't you be on this committee, and why don't you be on that committee, and why don't you take part in this and that? And you know what, you lead this because you've been gone, as though, I've been playing games. like that's really disturbing as well too, that you get hit on both ends.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for bringing these topics to light. It's definitely important to be discussing these things. And we are very pressed for time. We have half an hour, so we're going to get through as many questions as possible. But this is in line with what we are talking about. We've seen women being overlooked in formal records, and the tangible objects providing critical evidence of their histories being ignored. How do you find that impacts historical research and resources today?
Well, I mean, I'll just jump in with something that's a little bit at a different angle. So, I'm finishing a book right now that's a biography. And one of the things that I was kind of struck by in the beginning was how few Pulitzer Prizes have gone to either women who, writers, or about subjects that are women. It's less, you can count them on one hand for the whole 100+ years, right? And so, I mean, the women that I write about, it's not often, I can find sources about them quite often, right? It's a matter of how the kind of critical apparatus and the societal apparatus, and whether or not they choose to find those sources valuable, right? Or, in the case of, yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just leave it at that. But I think that it's also a problem of what gets valued and what doesn't get valued, right? It's not always that there aren't sources there to use, especially, like Saidiya's book was mentioned, in that case, if you're willing to be more elastic, which, obviously, like the whole field of medieval history has been this way for a while. It's not like we don't accept that in history, right? To do this kind of critical confabulation at times. But the sources can be there. It's like, do people value what they have to tell us, I guess, is to my mind equally important.
And I just want to add something that is such an important point, right? It's not always that the archives aren't there, but sometimes women's archives or archives of their activities are not seen as valuable or important, right? And I think it makes for bad history, actually, because, I mean, one thing I have noticed, and I'm teaching a class using our archive right now called Counter Histories of the Chicano movement, is that the archive is right there staring them in the face. These historians, they just haven't chosen to look at certain organizations where women predominated. And these are not women's organizations, right? And I'll give you a very quick example of this. In Histories of the Movement for Chicano Studies as an academic field, usually accounts focus on departments and the development of a National Association of Chicano Scholars. But in fact, there was a radical organization at the same time parallel to these developments that was largely run by women, but it was considered a general radical organization to support Chicano studies that is always sort of tossed out as unimportant because it didn't win the day. Well, right. Surprise, surprise. Yes, of course, the more traditional academic, formations won the day, right? Because the university wanted those formations to succeed because they matched what the university wanted. But these more radical formations aren't talked about. And that's a real problem because there is a narrative that's built in that's basically like, well, radical formations of knowledge are always going to lose. Well, no, they were actively shut down, ignored, sidelined, and they were run by women, right? And so, what I'm interested in is thinking about like, what are those sources, those historical sources, those escape rooms, those places where radical futures are imagined that are being shut off from people today, when in fact they offer us ways of imagining different kinds of futures for ourselves, different models of sociality and infrastructures of care. And I'm sure everybody on this panel has experienced like seeing these other worlds that are possible in the past and in the archive that have been shut down because, nobody's written about them or cares about them.
Thank you for those powerful remarks. We do have a question from Zoom that I would like to ask here. And this question is for all panelists. What is the most difficult thing about women's history? Also, how is women's history different from traditional historiography? So whoever wants to answer that one first.
So for me, it's the harm. It's the harm that's been done to women. I write for and can speak for Black women's experiences, and I'm teaching a Black women's history class now. And my students are grieved when they read about these histories that they've never been exposed to before. They've never thought about the origins of gynecology and how enslaved women's bodies were experimented upon. They've never read about how, the rampant sexual assault of Black women has played out over the 19th century and early 20th century. And this inability to have ownership of your body is grievous. And I think a lot of times the stereotype, especially for Black women, is, oh, you're an angry Black woman. But no one has ever tried to reckon with what that anger means, where that anger stems from, that so much of that anger comes from a place of grief, comes from a place of harm. And so in my classroom, I have to really redeem a lot of the humanity of Black womanhood, and to show women as mothers, as sisters, as friends, as daughters, as vulnerable, as deserving of protection, as worthy of protection. And that for me is really, really hard. You know, I have a group of academic friends. We talk about this all the time, how sometimes we get in the archive and, whoo, we've got to meditate. Whoo, I have to cry. Like, I've got to step out. I need to take a minute, because what you just read, this sexual assault, this violence, this murder, this beating, is too hard to digest just in one sitting and then regurgitate it on the screen or on the paper. You have to sit with that violence if you're going to be able to show why it matters. And that for me is something that I still have a tough time grappling with, the inhumanity of Black womanhood.
Yes, thank you for all of that. And actually, we have a question from YouTube that is kind of in line with this, and in line with actually what we had planned our next question to be. So many of you as women with minority identities, how do you navigate, and just as women, how do you navigate the tension between existence and research as inherently political and the need to play the game within or tangential to academia? And that was from a YouTube audience member. I saw a lot of facial responses. If anyone wants to begin.
I'm just going to begin and open and build upon what we just heard, which is very powerful. I think part of what compounds the pain is that all of this was erased from history, the erasure. And that's something that whenever we find voices that we never heard of, half of humanity has been erased from the record. And the record is there, or parts of the record are there, and those voices have simply been ignored. So I think that compounds in certain ways what one feels, not only that this terrible pain was inflicted, but that it was muffled and silenced for sometimes decades and centuries until we open up these archives.
Is there anyone else that would like to take a stab at that?
Can you repeat the question again, just one more time, or paraphrase it one more time?
Emma, did you want to?
Sorry, I was muted. So the question from the audience member was, how do you navigate the tension between existence and research that is inherently political and the need to play the game that's within or tangential to academia? And this can extend to just your experiences navigating your respective field.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'll just say, I think that sometimes, I think some women do themselves a disservice when they distance themselves from their experiences, because they think that if they write about their identity, their family, what they know, that people will dismiss that work as, well, it's too personal. Well, you know, oh, well, she's biased, right? Like, I think that is sort of the tendency within the field, is to dismiss people who do this work, or work that reflects their identity. And I push back on that hard, because, you know, we don't say to white men, well, you study great white men because you aspire to be a great white man, or you think you are a great white man. Like, we don't say, no, you're too close to that. You can't do George Washington, okay? Like, we don't do that. It would be ridiculous. It would be ridiculous. And it is ridiculous. I think those who are closest to the pain, who are closest to the story, should be at the forefront of those stories. Now, they're certainly not the only ones who can tell those stories. I've read wonderful monographs about Black women that are not written by Black women. It is possible. But I think that we, again, have to be honest about sort of the can I just be frank, like the bullshit of impartiality, like that does not exist. It does not exist, right? We are all biased. We are all biased. And until we have a moment where we can say, we have written and presented history through a very white supremacist lens, and that it is going to take very selfish acts on the behalf of women and people of color to rectify that narrative, then we're never going to get varied stories. We're never going to get a diversity of history. We're always going to be regurgitating the things that we think are safe or politically okay or won't generate pushback, because we don't want to be seen as sensitive, or we don't want to be seen as too passionate. And I just think that's garbage. Just think it's garbage.
Well, and I think that's what I just wanted to say one brief thing before I let it just, I think that's also what's very important about a layer of change that still has to happen within the academy, right? Which has to do with the kind of policing of women and people of color's personalities so carefully, right? I am struck by this all the time, right? That I look at the ways that white men in positions of leadership can behave certain ways that if anyone else tried that, it would really be trouble, and, I think that goes to, the whole larger problem, right? But I think that it's going to take that kind of frankness that you're talking about, Kelly, to change that,
And I think another angle on this is like, as someone who studies, radical social movement histories, some of which were situated in the academy, I think what's so interesting, and this is true for women's studies, and ethnic studies, is these were radical formations that demanded a different kind of university. Right, in their first instantiation in the late 1960s, Third World People's Strike in the Bay Area, they were demanding a university responsible to the people, right? Responsible to address the sort of prevailing issues impacting the community surrounding the institutions, right? Of course, the institution defanged women's studies, queer studies, ethnic studies. It recast those radical interventions in its kind of stamp, right? And it's with its hierarchies and with its practices. And so those of us studying those radical histories, I think are really, it's important for us not to just like, focus on subjects or topics that have been understudied, right? But to really reimagine how our scholarship, the kind of work it's doing in the world, and to reimagine our relationship, right, betwixt and between, the university as a community or an institution and the communities that we care about, and whatever those communities are, right? So for me, it's like, imagining, I think Stefano Harney and Fred Moten said the only relationship to the modern university is theft, right? Because the university, if we are resources within the university, how are we taking back, right, our own labor and placing it in the spaces that we think matter most? And so I often, people get kind of upset with me when I say like, that I'm constantly stealing from the university, whether it be paper clips, paper, photocopies, or my own labor back from the university, right? And putting it in the communities that I care about. And that doesn't always mean community service, right? It means like, what knowledges am I creating? And I think someone else was saying earlier, amplifying, right? And that's kind of how I see like how we tackle this problem of the university, which is, a white supremacist space, a space of power, wealth, prestige that holds up the ruling class, and our own dissident natures and dissident work. Like, how do we square that, right? So.
Thank you for that. I have so many questions left to ask, but I'm really on the spot here going to try to combine 3 questions into one. Maria, this is, I'd like for you to answer this one, and then if anybody else would like to join in, please feel free. What are some of the ways in which women of color, as your work has examined, have negotiated their roles as Native ethnographers and developed narrative tactics to decolonize knowledge? And then also maybe if you can speak on, the fact that Chicana feminists felt a need to start a separate movement from the Chicano movement and the feminist movement, and just talk about some of the struggles that present day Chicanas face. I know it's really loaded, but if you could just kind of work your magic and answer all that in one for us.
I think I want to give time to other people to talk. So what I will say about this is the first question references my first book. And, I'm happy to talk to anyone about my first book, which is about Native ethnographers. And in many ways, I find myself in the position of a Native ethnographer. The first person we interviewed was my mother. She has a massive archive in her home. We scanned it. And, obviously that's a super close relationship. We did snowball sampling out from her network and built out on that using her network. So, there's all kinds of effective relationships that are happening there that I embrace. And Kelly talked about earlier, it's like this idea of the distant observer. It is largely a fiction. It's a fiction from the Enlightenment. It's a fiction from the establishment of the university as an institution, and the humanities as a science, trying to model after science. This is not something that is a realistic framework for doing our work for anyone, not just women of color or white women or, white men even. I think I want to leave it there, because I do want to give other folks a chance to well, you're not going to talk about Chicano feminism, but
we can talk about oral history, though. I think if we can open that up to just like in your experiences in research, the role of oral history.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, what I will say is that, I remember when I talked to you guys earlier, I said I don't really identify as an historian. I'm
right.
Even though I was trained by historians, but it was interdisciplinary training. And I love historians. I hang out with them all the time. They let me go to their conferences occasionally. I feel like definitely a sense of connection to the methodologies. And I think there is a great deal of value in those historical methodologies, particularly training our students to understand archives and read them critically.
Actually,
but I consider myself more of a memory keeper, and that is because in large part because the women whose lives I document are alive, and I feel a connection to them and a responsibility to them, mm-hmm. right? And that, the relationship to the archive then becomes quite different, right? So anyway.
So because we're pressed for time, I'm just going to go into the next question. So I'll start with Kelly, but this is also for everyone, because I know when we talked yesterday, Elisheva, you also had things to say about this. But drawing from research and experiences, would you be able to speak towards the achievements and barriers Black women go through, including the queer community, and off that vein, women and women of color experiencing class disparities?
That's a lot.
No, I'm sorry. It's the nature of this conversation.
Women and class disparities. And I mean, so one of the hardest challenges that I've had in teaching a Black women's history course, and we go it's called From Mumbet to Michelle Obama. We go from Mumbet because Elizabeth Freeman was the first Black woman to sue for her freedom in the 18th century and win her freedom, to Michelle Obama, because I like the alliteration of Mumbet and Michelle Obama. So, but today, we're also talking about Kamala Harris now as well in terms of like political leadership. But there's so much to cover that I'm finding you really need a whole unit on queer women. You need a whole unit on class and class struggle, that oftentimes I think we spend a lot of time talking about poor Black women or working class white women. We know nothing about affluent, wealthy, elite Black women, or very, very little. And I think when it comes to these histories, we have to be very strategic about our syllabi. Our syllabi is so political, and students pay attention to the silences, what you don't cover, who's missing. And so I'm very honest with the class that this is not an exhaustive history. I cannot give you everything in this particular course. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of something. And so that's what I try to do. But it's exciting to me that it's not exhaustible. You know, if I can give you everything of Black history in 12 weeks, that's not much of a history. So I'm happy that there's so much literature out there now that I can direct students to all kinds of books. And there's something for them, more than books. There's films, there's documentaries, there's podcasts. I love a good podcast. There are a lot of different ways that you can tackle this, and that's what's encouraging to me. But you know, this work is inexhaustive.
Thank you. Elisheva, I don't know if you wanted to talk to about class disparities.
So I want to step back again just for 1 second and say, one of the things you have to do when you're a historian is teach students not only to remember, but also to forget what they know today so that they can understand the past. Mm-hmm. And that's very, very difficult. There's so much intrusion of what we know to be the case now that it colors and distorts the way things used to be. Mm-hmm. So teaching myself, but also teaching my students to look upon the world of the past without that overlay, and then to see it unfold and to understand that the world we have today is in some sense contingent and was not preordained, is one of the important things that, especially as a historian of the Jewish people whose position in society changed tremendously in the 19th and 20th century, it's hard for students to imagine that there was once a time when that was not the case, when they were the most reviled and the most segregated and the most feared people in all of Europe. And then one of the things we discussed yesterday, just very briefly, is the fact that some of the tensions, even within this tiny minority society on the margins of society, there's plenty of class tension, there's plenty of gender disparity, you know. So these things exist everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone else? Maria, did you want to answer? I see you're unmuted. Okay. I will ask the next question. So you are all born of contemporary late 20th feminist context, yet as historians, you write about very different histories. How did those politics shape how we know about the past? And I'd like to start with Hilary, if you don't mind.
Sorry. Sorry about that. Well, I mean, I think it's hard for me in a way to answer this question because, you know, late 20th century feminism was like so built into my whole life because my mother was so influenced by this, right? And raised her 4 daughters as a single mom, you know, to be feminists. Like, I don't really feel like we got a choice, right? We listened to Free to Be You and Me when we were tiny. And so I guess, you know, what's happened is, like feminism, you know, was that an intersectional analysis? I mean, surprisingly so. I would say I would give my mom credit for being someone that was, you know, very attuned to race and class privilege. And so more than I think, you know, we sometimes associate, you know, with the kind of, maybe it's because she wasn't from that milieu herself exactly. She was from a very working class immigrant milieu. But she certainly did not end up there and could have taken a different turn and raised us to be more conscious of these issues than I felt like most of my peer white, you know, suburban middle class peers in the Midwest were. I mean, I think it's a hard question for me to answer. I mean, I think my mother predisposed me, and this kind of relates to what many of you are saying, particularly Maria, to also really want to listen to women's stories, because she was a psychologist who specialized particularly in women who have been sexually assaulted or victims of domestic abuse. And so I think that like when I went to graduate school, as I said, my inklings were somewhat inchoate, but I knew a time period and I knew that I was interested in, you know, women's stories. And it was really that vague. But I think, you know, that is that, you know, just move of that moment of the personal is political. I think graduate school tries to kind of teach you that's not okay, as you were saying, Kelly. And so you develop a whole way of talking about it that abstracts that personal piece out of it. Even if, like myself, you consider yourself a feminist scholar, it's still hard to kind of, until you get to a certain place, I think, claim that personal connection, for me anyway. But I guess that's how I'd answer that.
Yeah, if anyone else wants to speak towards that, and then we can go to our final question. Okay, so can you speak to towards the disproportionate numbers of women of color and Indigenous women and Black women teaching higher ed? How can we empower and offer mentorship for gender minorities from underrepresented groups within the university setting, and to encourage people to not to be like as daunted by the university as they may seem to want to be daunting?
I will say for me, this was my experience. I didn't know how to get into graduate school. I didn't really know what historians did until I entered the Ronald Mcnair program. Now they have the Mellon program and there's a Ford program. There are a lot of pipelines, I think, that do the work of mentorship. And that's really what it comes down to in a lot of ways. You can't be something if you can't see it. And so having a mentor like Edna Medford did for me, like, this is what historians do. She took me to the archive, you know, and the archive was like this abstract thing. I was like, what is it? A library? Is it a museum? Like, you know, like you don't really know what it is until someone shows you and exposes you and prepares you. And not only that, but like, you know, how do you write like a historian? It's not the same as writing an op-ed. It's not journalism. And the craft that goes into that, I think, requires a lot of mentorship. You cannot just sort of stumble your way into reading these books and writing these papers without the helping hand of a critical eye and someone who can carefully tell you how this work is constructed. And so I think we need to do more of that, but I push back hard on the idea that these women don't exist, that these women aren't there whenever there's a job search committee and it's sort of like, oh, we don't know anyone. Yes, you do. Like, a lot of that is about wanting to perpetuate comfortability within who we work with. But there are women, lots of women out here who are doing this work. And, you know, I tell people all the time, like, there's no better place to start than at historically Black colleges and universities, our HBCUs, Howard University, Spelman, Hampton, FAMU. We look at so many of our political leaders today, and they are products of HBCUs. And I think if there was more of a pipeline to target those particular places and say, hey, like, how do we get these people into higher education? And then not just recruit them, but retain them, right? Pay them what they need to be paid in order to live in these high rent cities. You know, it's great to teach at CUNY. I was at Hunter College. It's super expensive to live in New York City, and the compensation does not support someone that does not have generational wealth like most POCs do. I can't, you know, get a mortgage from my parents or just get a loan from grandma. It doesn't work like that in a lot of poor and marginalized communities. And so the support has to be financial, the recruitment has to be intentional, and that dynamic has to be repeated over and over again.
Great. Yeah, I see a few cosigns. If anyone else wants to add anything, we can start our closing. And I'll leave that to Saida.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to each one of you for joining us today. I was very emotional throughout this webinar, and I didn't expect that I would be. I just sort of I was overcome with emotion, and just hearing all of your inspirational stories, and not only just your own journeys, but then how you talk about other women who didn't have a voice or don't have a voice, and how you guys are carrying that burden on your shoulders. And I just want to say that it was very, very, very inspiring and touching for myself, also as a woman of color who doesn't come from a family who, you know, I was the first to graduate in my family. And so just navigating the whole university system and trying to understand, I'm very, very touched. I want to thank Emma as well for, you know, all of the work that she puts in, and it's truly a labor of love. I want to thank Fiona and Hannah, who are our office assistants. They also help a lot in putting this panel together. We have a new website page and podcast access. Yeah, I think Emma will put the link out, so you can definitely catch us on, you know, your morning jog if you want to listen to our podcast. We have an April panel coming up. The topic is queer liberation movements and Black lesbian feminism. We're very much so looking forward to that panel. And again, thank you all so much for joining us today.
Yeah, and thank you, Eugenia. She had to bow out due to technical difficulties. The conversation obviously was still wonderful, but we also appreciate and recognize her presence as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much, all the co-panelists and Saida